Well, welcome to our next class on Rambam or Nevuchim. I think this is lecture number 76 or 77, one of those. And we are in chapter 29 of book 2 of the Mor Nevuchim. You can find it on page 344 is where we're up to. We're in the middle of chapter 29 in volume 2 of the Pines edition. That would be the right page for that edition. So, are we good? Well, let me mute everyone. Sorry. We have just learned until now this whole idea that that when the prophets use grand poetic language that refers to the sun and the moon and the the sun is the moon is going to disappear into darkness and the great heavens shake and the earth shakes and all this stuff, that it's all it's spoken in metaphors, it's poetic ways to discuss dramatic worldly events, but they are not ever referring to an actual change in the nature of science. So when they talk about these grandiose events, the sun still goes around the earth, or that was the way he would have thought about it, but the earth goes around the sun, however you want to look at it, right? The stars still do stars things, and mountains still do mountain things, and so on. So science doesn't change. So and all of those verses that seem to indicate otherwise are spoken in metaphors, are spoken in as a poetic language to describe various earth-shattering events. Now, there's an obvious problem with this theory, because there are some events in the Torah, in Tanakh, that are described that are clearly changes in nature, and Rambam is about to deal with those, and that is the issue of miracles. But before that, let's just read one paragraph, where we're in the middle of page 344. The notion toward which we are driving has already been made clear, namely that the passing away of this world, in other words, that the universe will end. Remember, when the Rambam says the universe will end, that to him means that the laws of nature will change, right? Because remember, without knowing the laws of nature, of physics that we know in modern time, that eventually the universe will self-implode, because the forces that bring things together will overcome the forces and the whole world will just collapse into another a backward Big Bang in 18 bajillion years, whenever that's going to be. That's something that, according to the Rambam, would have been against the laws of physics as he knew it. According to the Rambam, and his time, Aristotelian physics dictated that the laws of physics dictate that the world should, as is, has to always be, because this is what the laws of physics result in, a world such as the one that you and I see every day. So so the passing away of this world, or a change of the state in which it is, right? Or in other words, a change in the laws of science, or a thing's changing its nature, and with that the permanence of this change. And these are important words here, and you'll see why in next paragraph, that something should all of a sudden change. In other words, typically water runs from uphill to downhill, right? And then the nature of water should all of a sudden change, and it should go uphill instead. That's something that should never permanently change. In other words, the Rambam is leaving a place for maybe once in a while it might change for a few seconds in order for God to perform a miracle, but we'll get that in a minute. But for now, he's saying that nothing can change its nature like forever. The laws of science are permanent, are not affirmed in any prophetic text or any statement of the sages either. You won't find it anywhere, or even in the statements of Chazal. Right? Even though you'll find some statements that might sound that way, such as, for when the latter say something such as the following: the world lasts for 6,000 years, and 1,000 years it is a waste. This is a statement from the Medrash. I'm sorry, from the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah and the Gemara in Sanhedrin, that indicates that the world is created and destroyed, and it lasts for 6,000 years, and then there's a seventh. So the Rambam is saying they do not have in mind total extinction of being. It doesn't mean that the laws of science are going to change and all of a sudden the world won't exist anymore for that amount of time. That's not what it means at all. His expression 1,000 years at a waste indicates that time remains, right? The universe still exists. Time still exists. Otherwise, you couldn't measure it and say it lasts for 1,000 years. If it ceased to exist, then you can't measure it in time, right? Because time is a creation too. Time is one of those rules of physics. Besides, it is so clearly what it must mean is in some grand way, in some way, their civilization could go on and prosper for a certain amount of time, and every once in a while there might be a long period of time where civilization, like is laid to waste, or the world goes into decline for a long period of time, or something like that. Rambam doesn't bother going into explaining what it actually means, because that's not the point here. The point is that it doesn't mean that existence ends. It just means there's a long period of time of decline of some sort, right? Um, Besides, even if you don't like my explanation, right? Even if you think that it means, right, that the world actually is laid waste for 1,000 years, it is the saying of an individual that corresponds to a certain manner of thinking. That statement in the Medrash is what one rabbi said, because that's how he thinks. It doesn't obligate us. And this is not the only place. This is one prominent place, but there's many places where the Rambam dismisses one shita, one opinion that's mentioned in Chazal, because it's contradicted by everything else. The Rambam brought us already enough proofs from Chazal and Tanakh that this idea that the nature doesn't change is important, is solid. So if there happens to be a saying in Chazal that doesn't sound like that, okay, all right, that's one opinion, that's fine. We can put that opinion aside and just reject it. On the other hand, you constantly find, in other words, and if you're going to, so first of all, Rambam says that one opinion doesn't even mean that the world will stop existing for 1,000 years. It just doesn't mean that. But even if it did mean that, I don't really care, because that's just one opinion of one rabbi, right? And against that, you constantly find as the opinion of all the sages, and as a foundation on which everyone among the sages of the Mishnah and the sages of the Talmud bases as proof, saying there is nothing new under the sun, and the view that nothing new will be produced in any respect or from any cause whatsoever, right? So in other words, you find it all over the place, and the Rambam already brought proofs to this. And when it says there's nothing new under the sun, Rambam's interpretation of that verse, that famous verse of Kohelet, is a proof to the Rambam. Rambam is using that verse as a proof to his idea that science doesn't change. The laws of nature don't change, right? Because there's nothing new under the sun. In other words, everything we see in the world around us is always running according to the rules of science, right? Nothing new under the sun doesn't mean that John Doe won't be born tomorrow, because John Doe didn't exist, right? So obviously he's new. John Doe is a new guy, right? But he's nothing new under the sun, because the laws of nature that dictate how human beings have babies and people like this guy named John Doe come to exist.
The only thing I was thinking is I want to list all the.
Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. So to me, what people think it means, says even the heavens and the earth that will be created. So then he says, and even if you think when it says the new heavens and a new earth, and here Rambam is referring to a Bereshis Rabbah, a Medrash, which we have a different version of, but here this is Rambam's version, where it says that there's going to be a new heaven and a new earth, that at some point there's going to be like a new planet, right? This may be supported by people who think that there's another planet, extraterrestrial beings on a different planet or something. So even the heaven and the earth that will be created in the future are already created and subsist. For it is said, they subsist before me. It is not said they will, but they do subsist. And he quotes in his proof saying there's nothing new under the sun. So in other words, even where the Medrash seems to talk about the earth that we're on will somehow cease to exist, and another earth will somehow take over its place as the place where we all live, or wherever things happen, that Medrash is thinking that earth is floating out there in space someplace. It's there. It exists. We just don't see it in front of ourselves. Maybe it's one of those planets where we're going to move to in 100,000 years. Who knows, right? But do not think that this is in contradiction to what I've explained. If such a planet out there exists, well, it already exists, right? So it's not a new thing in the sense that it is newly created, like a new change in existence. For it is possible that he means that the nature that will necessitate in time the states of existence that have been promised is created since the 6 days of the beginning, and this is true, right? That there will be those concepts of science which will lead eventually to the habitable planet changing in some way. That is part of the process of nature as it goes on, that has already been created, right? So if the laws of physics would lead to this earth somehow not existing, at least in the opinion of that, Rambam is not right now supporting this particular statement of the sages or not. He's not saying whether he believes in it or not. That's not the point. The point that he's trying to make is that even this very radical and strange view, which we don't really know or understand what it's talking about, still doesn't suggest that an actual change in the laws of physics would take place, not even according to that guy's opinion. Okay, so and so that's how the Rambam insists that even that guy says there's nothing new under the sun, right? So even this very odd statement doesn't believe that the laws of nature change. Okay, so what about the big problems, the big gorilla in the room? So think to yourselves, we all know, as we learn through the Torah, of cases where nature changed, right? That is what a miracle is, right? Well, we all got out of Egypt because the sea split. Now that, as far as we all know, is contrary to the laws of nature, that water doesn't just split, right? So what's going on? So I have said, the Rambam said, that a thing does not change its nature in such a way that the change is permanent, merely in order to be cautious with regard to miracles. Remember what I mentioned to you before, that the Rambam was very careful, and he's saying now, I'm telling you, I was careful. I was being, in order to be cautious. He was very careful, and he said, a thing's changing its nature never has a permanence. In other words, God doesn't change the laws of nature. The laws of nature always happen. But there might be a change that happens for a moment, for a specific time, for a specific reason, because God wants to do it, and that's what a miracle is. Now, I want you to watch this paragraph very carefully, because this paragraph, Rambam is going to give us two different views of what a miracle is. And scholars debate forever which one the Rambam himself really believed. None of us will ever know the answer to that question, but you can read this paragraph with me, and you'll decide on your own which one you think the Rambam really believes. But then we'll compare that with later statements then when he comes back to the subject of miracles. But remember, after giving us all these speeches about how nature always stays the same, well, what do you mean? It doesn't stay the same. What about the miracles? So here we go. All right. So the Rambam says at this point, things can change their nature for a temporary period of time. For although the rod was turned into a serpent, right? We know that the staff of Aaron was turned into a snake, the water into blood, right? For the Makkah, the first of the 10 plagues. And the pure and noble hand became white, right? The hand of Moshe, became white with mitzorat kashalig. It became white like with leprosy, without a natural cause that necessitated this. There was no law of nature that you can find that says that every once in a while sticks just turn into snakes. There's no such law of nature. That's against the laws of nature, right? However, these these and similar things were not permanent and did not become another nature. So here the Rambam seems to be saying that the reason why these miracles could happen and the laws of nature never change is because a permanent change in nature will never happen. But a temporary change, God will do, right? Remember, Rambam will emphasize and has emphasized that God could do whatever he wants. He just doesn't change the laws of nature. He could, but he just doesn't. But every once in a while he does. And that's what a miracle is. A temporary change in the law of nature. But as they, may their memory blessed, say, the world goes its customary way. Olam kiminhago noeg. But the world continues on in its normal way. Now, this is my opinion, and this is what ought to be believed, period, okay? In a minute, the next sentence, the Rambam is going to give an entirely different explanation, which it goes on a whole different thing. But the Rambam seemed to say very clear, this is what I think, and this is what ought to be believed. And this is much more consistent with what traditional Jewish belief, as most of us have learned and studied and believed our whole lives, is, right? That a miracle is that God changes the nature for a specific time, for a specific purpose, and that's what a miracle is, period. Now, however, the Rambam is going to bring Chazal to give a completely different understanding of miracles, which will take out a lot of the miraculous nature of miracles. And you're going to see what I mean right now. The sages, may their memory be blessed, have made a very strange statement about miracles, the text of which you will find in Bereshis Rabbah and in Medrash Koheles. This notion, and many of you have heard, and there's several statements throughout Chazal where they talk about how certain realities were created before creation, right? Certain miraculous things were, and the Rambam is going to understand this in a very interesting way. It consists of in their holding the view that miracles too are something that is in a certain respect in nature. That a miracle is actually not a miracle. A miracle is actually one of the rules of nature, right? When God created the world, he created a world. They say that when God created that which exists and stamped upon it the existing natures, he put into these natures that all the miracles that occurred would be produced in them at the time when they occurred, right? So in other words, God created a world with certain laws of physics, okay? You light a fire, things get warm, all the laws of physics. Water runs down, there's gravity, there's electromagnetic forces, all the forces that make the world work. But God created also a world that at a certain moment in time, when certain conditions will be met, a splitting of the sea will occur, right? Now, that sounds crazy because that's not the normal course of things, but it was also created. So you understand the catch here, right? So all of a sudden, this is not a miracle anymore, right? All of a sudden, it's a law of nature, right? It's a law of nature that under certain circumstances, seas will split. Well, now that circumstance only happens when Egyptians are chasing Jews at a certain point in history, at a certain time, on a certain day, when all the factors are correct and in place, the sea will split, right? But it's a law of nature that dictates that, because God, just like he created all the other laws of physics, he created that law of physics, right? So according to now he put into these natures that all the miracles that occurred would produce them at the time when they occurred. According to this opinion, so now what about the prophet? The prophet comes and says, a miracle is going to occur, whatever. Elijah, Eliyahu on Mount Carmel says, a miracle is going to occur, God's going to bring a fire from heaven, right? He goes and prays, God's going to bring a fire from heaven. And then a fire comes from heaven, a miracle, all right? So the sign of a prophet consists in God making known to him the time when he must make his proclamation. The greatness of Elijah in this interpretation, I'm just using that as an example, but you can pick your favorite miracle, right? Is not that Elijah asked God and God said, okay, now I'm going to make a miracle and change the nature and make a fire come down. But the greatness of Elijah is that he had enough knowledge of God and enough wisdom and that prophecy and to know that under these circumstances, at this moment, this miracle will occur, because that's what's built into the nature of the world. So the greatness of the prophet is one of having the wisdom to know and understand when miracles will occur, but not that he makes God make a miracle happen, or he asks God to make a miracle happen, and so on. So, and thereupon a certain thing is affected according to what was put into its nature when first it received its particular impress. In other words, when God created the rocks that created the mountain of Carmel, right? He put into them the nature that when all the Jews are going to gather around, and Eliyahu is going to bring a cow, and the Baal prophets are going to bring their cow, and they're going to dance around and try to make a fire come from heaven, it won't come. And now God will, when at this moment, in the nature of the Mount Carmel exists that a fire will descend from heaven and show the people what the greatness of Eliyahu was, that he had that wisdom, and in that sense he ousted and beat the prophets of the Baal, because the prophets of the Baal did not have that wisdom and had no way of knowing such a thing, because they weren't prophets, they were just Baal worshippers. If this statement is as you will see it, it indicates the superiority of the man who made it. So the greatness of a miracle is now not the fact, it's not the change in nature that occurred, like, wow, this crazy thing happened, right? But it's, wow, look how great that prophet is. How could he possibly have known, right? How could Moshe Rabbeinu possibly have known that if I raise the staff, the sea is going to split, right? How could I possibly, because the prophet is the knowledge, the wisdom. The hero now becomes the wise man, right? The prophet who has that faculty that he's able to perceive such things, right? And the fact that he found it extremely difficult to admit that if the statement is as you will see it, right, it indicates the superiority of the man who made it, and the fact that he found it extremely difficult to admit that a nature may change after the Masa Bereshis, the work of the beginning, right? The person, the rabbi in Chazal who made this statement, right, so deeply refused to accept that God would ever change nature, that he had to explain that it is a different understanding, right? That God, no, doesn't change nature. The Torah says miracles happen, so we have to believe that they happened. Well, they happened, but they weren't really miracles. They were really things that were set in nature prior to, at the same time as the world was created. Or that another volition may supervene after that nature has been established in a definite way, right? So he would refuse to imagine that God would all of a sudden change his mind and say, oh, before I wanted water to all kind of hang together. Now I want water today to split. No, I don't accept that. So instead of accepting that, he said that no, the laws of nature were placed from the beginning. So now when we see something in the Chazal that a certain nature, like the mouth of Bilam's donkey, for example, is one of those things that were created at the time of creation. What does it mean? The Rambam just told you what it means, right? At least according to the Rambam. For instance, he seems to consider that it was put into the nature of water to be continuous and to always flow from downwards, except at the time of the drowning of the Egyptians, it was a particularity of that water to become divided. So nature of water was established, with one exception. In the laws of physics, chapter 17, it says that on this date, it's supposed to split. That's what the physics textbook says, right? So I have drawn your attention to the spirit of that passage and to the fact that all this serves to avoid having to admit the coming into being of something new, right? Remember, Rambam himself told us that we shouldn't believe this. We should believe, right, that things do come new, right? Temporarily, they change, right? So this is a second opinion, right? But the Rambam, it goes into it with such depth and with such power that a lot of scholars think that the Rambam really believed in this second one, what we're reading right now. But like I told you, the Rambam himself said, right, regarding the first one, this is my opinion, and this is what ought to be believed. So he leaves us highly confused, but that was his intention, to give us these two approaches, these two very different approaches. And the good part of this is that if one of these approaches speaks to you better, you can take that, you can go home with it, and you can live the rest of your life that way and be a good holy Jew, right? Regardless of whether you believe that miracles are an actual change in nature or not. They're all good. The Rambam gave us permission here to believe either one of these possibilities. And then he says, it is said in the passage, this is another backup for the second way. Rabbi Yonasan said, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God, has posed conditions to the sea that it should divide before Israel. That is, right, the meaning of the words. And the sea returned to its strength when the morning appeared. Right, Rabbi Yirmiyahu, this son of Elazar said, the Holy One, blessed be, had posed conditions. I just turned the page, I'm at 346 now. Has posed conditions not only to the sea, but to all that has been created in the 6 days of the beginning. That is, even my hands have stretched out the heavens, and all their hosts have I commanded. I have commanded the sea to divide. I have commanded the fire to not harm Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Those in the book of Daniel were saved from the fire. Right? Why is it that they didn't get burned? Because when I made the physics of fire, I made a rule that on that day, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah shouldn't get burned. That was a rule of physics, right? The lions not to harm Daniel. Why all of a sudden were a bunch of hungry lions didn't eat Daniel, right? Because I made that rule. And the fish to spit out Yonah. So this medrash Rambam is bringing to support his assertion, right? That's what it meant. That God created that at the time of creation. He created those laws of physics just like he made the laws of science. All the other miracles can be explained in an analogous manner. So now we have two ways of understanding miracles, both very different, but both kosher ways of understanding, right? One, the Rambam brought several proofs from Chazal and really went into banging it in your head. And the other one, the Rambam shortly and quickly mentioned, but said it was his opinion. All right. So, the Rambam is going to change tunes a tiny bit, right? So I want to ask if there's any comments, because this is one of the most famous and also in many ways controversial statements of Rambam and Moreh Nevuchim, because you can imagine, I mean, this has ramifications for our whole religion, really. So I just want to know if there's anyone has anything to say, comment, anybody learned anything new, interesting, go ahead. Yeah, you can unmute, you have to unmute yourself.
Sorry, I moved my cursor. Anyway, when it says major implications for religion, when kind of the definition of miracle. So instead of saying God comes in and intervenes and changes the laws of nature, he says no. He just redefines nature to say you have to add miracles at the time of creation, and not as God intervening. I missed why this has major implications for religion, depending on which way you go.
Well, if you take the second understanding to its conclusion, right? So there are actual laws of nature, right? Right, that dictate when these miracles would happen. So if you go ahead, let's say, and you pick the story of Elio on Har Carmel, right?
Okay.
And you realize that, and you try to explain it by saying, Elio understood that if I do a certain thing, I would draw lightning to this spot, for example, right? That kind of goes along with the second thing that the Rambam said, right? Because Elio's genius was not necessarily was his wisdom, right? It wasn't necessarily that he asked God and God came and changed things. Elio understood the laws of nature, right? Right. So it wouldn't be so like all of those miracles, many of them we may not have the scientific explanations for, but one could argue that the scientific explanations do exist. So you can search and try to find what those scientific explanations are, right? Because Elio is simply wise enough to know and understand that under these conditions, right, a fire will come down. Those conditions might have included knowing how to draw lightning to a certain spot, right? Or yeah.
So you're saying that it's not in response to a human request.
Yeah, yeah, it wouldn't exactly. It wouldn't be in response to a human request. Now, so on the same thing would be if you were to explain, some other reason why, all these other miracles would happen. Now, many of the miracles don't really lend themselves to such an interpretation. It's very hard to figure out, right, why they happened, right? But if you try to explain, right, and then later on we'll see that Rambam tries often, and we've seen it a little bit already, to explain miracles in rationalistic ways, right? And so when you explain it in a rationalistic way, and it fits the laws of physics, or performed it. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, if you had asked me 15 minutes ago,
right,
what I thought about Judaism and the plagues and all that happened in Egypt, I think it's great. Moses asked God to do this, and he comes in and says, "Okay, I'm going to do it. I agree with you. We got to do this to get the Pharaoh scared." And okay, so that's sort of how I understood it. So now the second, now he's saying, no, look at it a different way. This was destined to happen, and Moses was a prophet, and the timing was what was key, and he knew beforehand this was going to happen. What I'm trying to process, how does that change my view of Judaism or Judaism itself? What's really the difference? There's a God, and he can intervene and do whatever he wants, and whether he does it time of creation, or he does it because Moses said, "Please do this." I'm trying to figure out how that affects anything in terms of theology.
Well, if when we pray, right, can we pray for God to change something, right?
Okay.
According to the second version, right, it's kind of silly to think that you can pray, right? Or if you draw it to its logical, you can draw this conclusion. You don't have to, but you can draw the conclusion from here that it doesn't make sense to pray for something to happen, right? Because God doesn't change things. The laws of nature go as the laws of nature goes, right?
Well, it seems to support, the second one seems to say that absolutely everything is preordained, because otherwise, why would this miracle, so to speak, be inserted at this time with these conditions? Then we already know, like, the story's just going to unfold.
It's not so much preordained because, well, it's preordained that under those conditions such a thing happen. Yes, I agree with that. But it's not preordained in the sense that some of the conditions that needed to be fulfilled came about through human beings' choices, right? Right? The choices that led to the Israelites being chased by the Egyptians to the sea.
But God would have known. But it sounds like, well, the story's kind of in my mind, it seems that the story then is already written because God knows that those exact conditions will occur.
No, or
Otherwise,
God knows that if those exact conditions occur because we choose them, right? Then, like, let's say when God came to Moshe at the bush, Moshe said, "Listen, God, you're a really cool guy, but I'm not doing this. I like it here in Midian. I'm not interested, right?" Or let's say the Jewish people, we see they cried out to God and he listened. Let's say they didn't cry. Let's say they just got so despondent in slavery they said, "You know what, we're just going to be slaves forever." I mean, if you change anything, any one of those events, and had everything played out differently, right? Would the conditions have been met for a splitting of the sea to occur? Probably not.
or
right?
did he have a second set of miracles that occur if this scenario happens? I mean, it's kind of a weird.
Yeah, I mean, it maybe all right. It could have been a different set. We don't know. Maybe there was another miracle. You're right that could have happened had a different set of circumstances happened. But this particular miracle happened under those circumstances, and that was written into science. But it is a way. It's a clever way of getting out of when someone says, "Are the laws of nature immutable?" Right? Or are the laws of nature? Does God change the laws of nature? With the second path, Rambam can continue with his idea that the laws of nature will never change. Not that God can't change them, but that he doesn't change them, right? And miracles are now no longer a violation of that rule, right? Because miracles were also laws of nature, right? And that's the clever thing that Rambam accomplished with this second path, right? And how we so if you and I are walking around and we don't have prophetic wisdom, so we don't know when the sea's going to split, right? So there's the thinking that God's going to intervene and change the laws of nature for us, right? It would be very silly according to the second path, right? Because this is the way physics works. This is what happens, Anyway, so those are the things. So very good. So I'm just gonna go. Any other questions, or could I go on?
Go ahead.
Okay, I do want to finish this chapter today, so I think we can do it. So the matter has now become clear to you, and the doctrine epitomized. I made it really straight. Namely, we agree with Aristotle with regard to one half of his opinion, right? And we believe that what exists is eternal a parte post. In other words, the laws of nature that exist are, and they always will be. So, and will last forever with that nature which he may be exalted has willed, that nothing in it will be changed in any respect unless it be in some particular of it miraculously, right? So nothing in the world will ever be changed unless in some specific detail he might intervene and change it temporarily. That's according to the first understanding. Although he may be exalted, has the power to change the whole of it or annihilate in nature that he wills, right? Right? He just doesn't, right? However, that which exists has had a beginning. In other words, and so all that we agree with Aristotle. But the following we disagree. That which exists has had a beginning, and at first nothing at all existed except God. There was a time when it started. His wisdom required that he should bring creation into existence at the time when he did do it, and that what he has brought into existence should not be annihilated, nor any of its natures changed, except in certain particulars that he willed to change. Those are miracles. About some of these we know, whereas about others that will be changed in the future, we do not know. Other miracles that may be coming down the pike, we don't know about them yet, right? This is our opinion and the basis of our law. By the way, he mentioned just 2 lines ago, right, that his wisdom required that he should bring creation into existence at the time when he did do it. This brings. I'm going to lead you to a really interesting podcast. Hold on. I'm going to post in the thing a link to it. So give me 1 second. If you can get this, it's the Habura podcast. Wait, where's the chat thing? There it is. Okay. Okay, I just put it up there. If you can cut and paste it for yourselves, it'll be up there the rest of the lecture, I guess. It's a really they have a lot of really interesting podcasts, this Chavurah podcast thing, but this one is in particular about Rambam here says that God created the world at a specific time when he willed it, and why at that time no one knows, right? Except God. It was his wisdom. I I direct you to listen to that podcast about the Kabbalistic Sefer Shomer Amunim, one of the early Kabbalistic works that agrees with the Rambam, but gives an answer as to why God created at a certain time, but it's a philosophical answer, not a Kabbalistic one, which is very interesting. His answer, the Shomer Amunim's answer, is that it's because I don't know if I should give this away. Maybe you should listen to the podcast. Well, I'll give it the basics away is as follows: really, like according to the laws of nature, right? Rambam agrees, right, that the laws of nature dictate that that the world that existed should always exist, right? Which he's emphasized many times, and that it should also have always existed, right? Because those same laws are always true. So then, why did God create the world, right? Right. So Rambam's answer is why didn't the world always exist, right? The same reason why he created it 5 billion years ago, he could have created it 10 billion years ago. So Rambam says we don't know why. That was his will. He decided to do it. That's something we'll never know. That was his wisdom. The Shomer Amunim says that for this specific reason, because if the world always existed, right, then you and I wouldn't be in awe of the creation because it would always have been. Right? The only reason why you and I have this tremendous feeling of awe and wonder over the creation is because we know that God created it, because at some point it didn't exist and then it existed, right? Anyway, but the more detail you can go into that podcast if you'd like. It's a very interesting podcast. Anyway, Aristotle, and now that you've listened to my lectures, a lot of that podcast will sound to you like bat, boom, you'll just know it right away. It'll be, oh, yeah, sure, I know what the Rambam says because we all studied it together, right? So you can speed through a lot of it because of that if you want. But anyway, this is our opinion debate. So Aristotle, on the other hand, thinks that just as the world is eternally parte post and will not pass away, it is also eternally parte ante and has not been produced. We've discussed this many times. Now we have already said and explained that this doctrine can be arranged in a coherent way only through a recourse to the law of necessity, and that necessity contains a presumptuous assertion in regard to the deity, as we have explained. I'm not going to go into all that. We've done it a million times. Now, as the exposition has finally reached this point, we shall now put in a chapter that shall likewise give several indications as to texts concerned with the account of the beginning. I'm now going to start discussing Bereshis. Man, I wanted to do this today, but I'm like scared to start because this could go long. But all right, let's try it. I might, if I cut in the middle, just forgive me. But so I'm going to start talking about Bereshis, basically how to learn Genesis, right? How to learn the parts of the Torah that discuss the creation of the world. For the first purpose of this treatise, the reason why I wrote this book is to explain what can be explained of the account of the beginning and of the account of the chariot, right? He said Masa Bereshis and Masa Merkava, right? The account of, which Masa Bereshis, which Rambam corresponds to Aristotelian physics, and Masa Merkava, which is Aristotelian metaphysics. Okay, we shall put in this chapter after we have first set forth two preambles of general import. I want to say two introductions, two things you need to know, and then in the next chapter 30, I'm going to start going into detail of how to study Bereshis. Now, this is one of another very famous statement of the Rambam, which has been often misunderstood, but I'm going to explain it to you how he says it so that you'll never misunderstand this again. Okay, so here's how it goes. One of these is as follows. Not everything mentioned in the Torah concerning Masa Bereshit is to be taken in its external sense as the vulgar imagine. The foolish vulgar people think that the words of Bereshit are meant literally. It is not meant literally. The Rambam says that in as clear of black and white terms as can ever possibly be said. Okay, that if you think that the Torah means exactly what it says as it is written, then you are one of those vulgar people. Okay, so remember that. And I telling you this exact passage in the Rambam, I have showed it to rabbis that have refused to believe what they were reading. Rabbis, after giving long speeches about contradictions between the Genesis and the Torah and science, and giving all kinds of reasons. And I told them, but the Rambam says this very, very clearly, and they would look at these words and they would literally twist their brains and their tongues and their mouths and their eyeballs to 7 different contortions in order to explain why it doesn't really say what he just said, but it does say what he just said. Now, I'm gonna go into a little bit into the distance, and I'm gonna read for you a little bit of Rav Kapach on this. You just have to give me a minute. But here we go. One of these, okay. For if the matter were such, if it was true, right, that I'm going to read this, and if you don't understand it fully, just hang in there, because I'm going to read Rav Kapach, who explains it really beautifully. For if the matter were such, the men of knowledge, in other words, the people of intelligence, the men of science is the terminology that Ron used, wouldn't have been so careful of divulging knowledge with regard to it, right? If they were exactly as they said, in other words, if it was an instruction manual, and this is how God created the world, and it was meant to be taken exactly literally, the sages also would not have expiated on its being kept secret and on preventing the talk about it in the presence of the vulgar. Chachamim would not have been so careful to keep it a secret. Now, why is that? For the external sense, I know some of this might not be clear, but I promise I will make it clear. For the external sense of these texts leads either to a grave corruption of the imagination, right? If you take the external sense, right, and to giving vent to evil opinions with regard to the deity, you might start thinking anthropomorphic ideas about God, right? If you read it simply as it's written, or to an absolute denial of the action of the deity and to disbelief in the foundations of the law, because you might be smart enough to realize that this isn't how the world was created, right? In which case, if you think that the Torah meant it literally, you will then deny that the Torah has any legitimacy, right? This is exactly the danger which leads so many people to say, I don't believe in the Torah, right? Because science tells me that the world is 15 billion, or universe is 15 billion years old, and life on Earth has evolved over billions of years, not over 6,000 years. And if you take the words of the Torah literally, you will then, and you're a smart guy, and that's what you think, you will then deny that God ever created the world, right? Because you'll say, oh, the Torah is, not true, right? It's wrong. The correct thing to do is to refrain. If one lacks if you don't know enough science and you don't know how the world was created, right? Just refrain from considering these texts merely with imagination, right? Don't start thinking with your own imagination what these words actually mean. What now? Now I'm going to stop here for a minute. I'm going to read to you what Rav Kapach says, because he's going to explain the points that the Rambam just made. Okay. So, and this is, I often quote from this. It's my favorite version of the Rambam in Hebrew, and he has notes, which are beautiful notes. And over here he says as follows: Kolomar, on this statement that I just read to you, this is what Rambam means to say, according to Rav Kapach. Im yavinum kipshutam, right? If people will understand them according to their simple meaning, then yavo'u lidei dimyonot shav biyachas lemetzias. They will then come to imagine things about science that are false, right? They'll start imagining things about science that are dimyonot shav. They are false, incorrect imaginations about what nature of science, about the nature of metziut, the nature of actual science. And worse than that, right? So in other words, so you can't understand them simply, because if you do, then you're going to conclude all kinds of goofy scientific ideas which are contradicted by what we know to be true. More than this, worse than this mistake is the following: is that right? If you go ahead and you interpret them literally, you're going to start thinking anthropomorphic ideas about God, right? Because read through Bereshit and you'll see right away. God says this is good, this is not good. He has conferences with angels, all kinds of things. You think he's like some kind of CEO, right? The whole thing, you're going to start making goofy ideas about science, right? And you're going to start making goofy ideas about God. And then those people that are smart, right? Shehiskilu, that they understood, right? They understand that, you know what? These words can't be understood if they're read straight, if you read them simply. Then they'll think, if you start thinking, well, these words don't make any sense, but they are meant to be said simply. In other words, if you are one of those guys like those many atheists that will do this all the time. They'll say, look, Bereshis, the book of Genesis says A, B, C, D, and it meant to say A, B, C, D. And we know that A, B, C, D is not true. So therefore, the book of Genesis is not true. The book is not true. God's not true. The whole thing. And then and then they will go ahead and start denying that the world was ever created, because they're going to say, so in other words, so those scientists that think that they can be atheists because they think that Bereshis was meant to be what it said. And since I know that those things aren't true, I therefore proved the whole thing wrong. They messed up the whole business. Now you can understand what's so great about what Rambam is telling us and what's so great about what he's about to tell us, because we're going to be studying a little bit tonight and in the next few weeks, things that the Rambam is going to tell us. And once Rambam says that they don't mean it simply as they're stated, they're not literal. Now we have accomplished a tremendous thing. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter anymore if those explanations that Rambam is going to give us, which are based on the Rambam's understanding of science, it doesn't matter anymore if they're even correct, right? Or even if it comes out that over time, it comes out that those scientific ideas of Aristotle that come later on might be disproven, right? But who cares? It's not important, right? If Aristotle's ideas or any other philosopher's ideas, even those things that the Rambam himself thinks are true based on his understanding of science. And Rambam goes and finds little hints in the verses of the Torah that seem to support his ideas. It doesn't matter. Right? Just like we understood them, we can disprove them. So in other words, because it doesn't matter. Because once you tell me that the words aren't meant literally, right, then you can explain any explanation. You can attempt to make explanations, but you can't say for sure that this is the explanation. So if somebody gets up and says, like, there's a lot of attempts, like a famous one is this book, which is a great book by a physicist named Gerald Schroeder, Genesis and the Big Bang, where he explains how the Big Bang is similar to Genesis and this and that and so on. It's all good, Ram says, that's fine. But if somebody were to disprove his ideas of physics next week, it doesn't matter, because that's not what's written in the verse, right? So the main thing being that if you do think that these words are to be understood according to their simple meaning, right? And then a scientist comes to you and argues, this is where the terrible danger lies, right? And this is how they can tear down, right, all of the walls that consist of the building, which builds our idea of religion and faith. It's from this perspective, right? It's even more important what the Rambam did not say, right, than that which the Rambam does say. So as the Rambam tells us now that you have to be careful when you explain these things. Why is it that the Chachamim were so careful that it has to be done in secret, that it has to be done carefully, that it shouldn't be done in public, that you shouldn't tell this to stupid people, right, or uneducated people? Why? That sounds so haughty. That sounds arrogant. Well, you're not going to teach the simple folk? No, you can't teach the simple folk, because every time you tell them this is the pshat, they go home and they think this is the pshat, and then next week, when another scientist disproves what you thought last week, they say, oh, the Torah is gone, right? How many times, I don't know if any of you have ever engaged in arguments or polemics or discussions about the subject of science versus religion, evolution versus creation, and some genius gets up and says, oh, I heard this lecture, it was great because he explained this with science, it's 15 billion years equals 2 days equals this equals that, and this, or evolution is that. And then the next week, that whole physics lecture goes out the window with a new discovery, a new experiment, right? Right? Everyone at the table or the discussion thinks that Bereshis was just disproven. That's why you have to be careful. And that's why the Rambam is going to continue saying, right? So one should not act like the wretched preachers and commentators who think that a knowledge of the interpretation of words is science, and in his opinion, wordiness and length of speech add to perfection. Here he's criticizing people that talk and talk and talk and talk and talk and sound really, 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 really complicated, as if somehow that's going to answer all the questions, when in essence, they really said nothing. On the other hand, it is obligatory to consider them with what is truly the intellect, after one has acquired perfection. He said, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't try when you do have the science and you do have the intellect and you do have the knowledge in the demonstrative sciences and knowledge of the secrets of the prophets. When you learn the Torah and you learn what the prophets have to teach, and you learn the science, and then you have an understanding that might explain the verse, go ahead. You have to do that. You have the obligation to try. However, as I have explained several times in our commentary on the Mishnah, none of those who know something of it should divulge it. And they say explicitly, as from the beginning of the book up to here, the glory of God requires to conceal the thing. And why should they not divulge it? Because of the mistakes that I just said. Even though you think you know those sciences, next week they might be wrong, right? Just like Rav Kapach explained. They say it at the end of what is said concerning the sixth day of the beginning. Thus, what we have said has become clear. However, in as much as the divine commandment necessarily obliges everyone who has obtained a certain perfection to let it overflow through us, if you have ideas, you should teach them, as we shall make clear in the chapters on prophecy that follow. Every man endowed with knowledge who has come to possess an understanding of something pertaining to these secrets, either through his own speculation or through being conducted towards us by a guide, must indubitably say something. It is, however, forbidden to be explicit about it. So what the Rambam's about to do in the upcoming chapters, right, is really just leading us on, giving us little hints, little bits, little flashes of maybe ideas that might explain it. But he doesn't want to be explicit and say, this is the way it is, because of the extreme danger in saying such a thing. He must accordingly make the secret appear in flashes. Many such flashes, indications, and pointers occur in the sayings of some of the sages, may their memory be blessed. But these sayings are mixed up with the sayings of others and sayings of another kind. For this reason, you will find that with regard to these mysteries, I will mention a single saying on which matter based and leave the rest alone, so you can go ahead and befits that should be left to them. The second preamble is very quick, so I'm going to read it quickly, right? Before I explain to you how to read Bereshis, and that is that prophets use equivocal words. For example, in the famous prophecy in Jeremiah in the beginning, where he says, Makel shaked ani ro'eh, I see a stick that's growing almonds, right? Where the purpose of the shaked is shoked ani, which the word shaked, which means almonds, also means I'm doing it quickly, I'm being diligent about something, right? And so on, as we shall explain in chapters on prophecy. With regard to the same principle, on the reference to the chariot, they use the word hashmal. Hashmal, which in modern Hebrew is translated to electricity. It obviously didn't mean electricity in Ezekiel, right? He gives different meanings, and you can read those. So in other words, when they use certain terms that have equivocal meanings, they could mean A, they could mean B, and they're used in order to demonstrate, they might envision a word or something that demonstrates a word, but then that word flips to mean something else when you're interpreting the meaning of their prophecy. So this concludes chapter 29, and gave us the basis of, and the Rambam really knocked down, and it's incredible to think about that to this day, people still arguing about what are essentially, once you read this Rambam, stupid things about, and excuse me for being harsh, about the issues of Genesis versus what it says here. The Rambam just told us exactly all we really need to know. Bereshis is not literal, and you can try and match it up with modern science, and it's all well and good if you do that, but don't think that that is the be all and end all of it all, because it might not be next year, right? As long as you understand that it's not literal, and that all of your intellectual endeavors after that are honest attempts, and you realize that that's all they are, just attempts, you'll be okay, and you won't think that God is a CEO sitting up there with a bunch of advisors, number one, and you also won't think that the world, that the Torah is foolish, God forbid, and it's all baloney, and there never was a creation because of a literal interpretation of Bereshis. All right, so I'll stop here. We have like 2-3 minutes to go with questions if you have any.
So was the biblical account of creation just a story that was written to accommodate people's level of knowledge at the time, or to satisfy people's quest for understanding of?
That's a really, really good question. I want you to hold it to next week, because the Rambam is going to, when he tells us about about how he interprets Bereshis. Well, first of all, the simple, quick answer to that question is it's simply an account that states that God created the world. And that's the really important thing, that there was a creation, right? It's not a description of how the creation happened. But now the Rambam is going to go ahead and interpret some of the verses in the account of creation, right? And tell us how he thinks, right? What they really mean, right? Right? With the caveat that he just told us that it may or may not actually be right. Like, in other words, like Rav Kapach told us that the Rambam himself is telling us that even if I'm wrong, right, it's okay. But he's going to do it anyway, right? Because the Rambam is going to be basing a lot of what he says on his understanding of science, which we know today is wrong, right? I mean, I doubt the Rambam ever thought that he would be proven wrong. Like we've said numerous times, I think he thought that Aristotelian science was the be-all and end-all of everything. But he did understand that it might not be, But anyway, but the much more extensive answer to that question we'll learn as we see how he treats the story of Bereshis and how he analyzes it. Then we'll see what kind of lessons he thinks we can learn from the story, other than the science. Okay, I'm sorry.
No, thank you. Thank you. Okay.
Any other comments or questions before we close up shop for the day? If there aren't, then thanks for hanging with me. I'm sure those of you I hope you're happy that you tuned in tonight, because this was a pretty cool night. We talked about miracles and we talked about Bereshis. These are two really, really big stuff from the Rambam, and really important.
So you're telling me that I shouldn't be double checking anything I read in the Torah against anything else?
If you're treating the Torah like a science book and you're trying to match it up with your latest up-to-date physics textbook, then yeah, I agree with you on that.
Well, I'll leave you with this concern. I want to avoid being vulgar, and I'm not sure how I can possibly avoid it given how I've been taught to read. So what can I do?
Well, let's see how the Rambam reads Bereshis, and I'll give you an example, and I'll teach you how to read it.
Okay, I'll be here next week.
Right. All right. Anyway, have a buddy.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
You're welcome.